our protagonists tend to be on the older end of the middle grade scale. So we started talking about it, and we realized, oh, this should be a panel. So I'm really excited for this conversation. But to get started, can we talk, Dina just gave kind of a great brief introduction of middle grade and YA. So can we just talk a little bit more about that? Of what does it mean to be upper middle grade? If anyone wants to start.
I mean, I'll go ahead if you want.
Sure, go for it.
So when I think of upper middle grade, I'm thinking of readers who are going to be probably in like 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and they're not necessarily ready for the YA world yet, but they're beyond the world of what we would consider just sort of the typical middle grade stories, I think. They're ready for a little bit more challenging material, both subject-wise and as far as the reading. And I think, the length can be a little bit longer, but we still have to write with a lot of sensitivity, and we need to think of the age of our readers. But it's like that little step. I had heard it called YA's little sister before, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, if I can build on what you're saying, it is definitely, as you said, the themes are chewier. I always call them chewier, tougher. I think that our readers at that stage are ready to tackle more, but they don't need the kissing so much, or some of those more complicated social situations. And you were just talking about YA's little sister and how that's called that. Part of me says, no, that's not it, because it really does carve out its own space. It is thematically as challenging as YA can be, but it is for a reader that is starting this developmental change between being fitting into the family and being part of the family structure, and now beginning to identify who they are outside the family structure. And YA, I think, is more firmly seated in that I'm figuring out me, whereas this is the liminal space, so to speak, in between that. So maybe I just got, when I heard little sister, I was like, no, I'm not the little sister. I'm my own
person. Yeah, and I think when I have a 13-year-old, almost 14-year-old daughter, and another kid who just turned 12, and when I think of my readers in this very murky upper middle grade, upper middle school space, they want books that are going to tackle some of these scarier topics like climate change and pollution, like human trafficking, like microaggressions and racism. But it's like they want, and also neurodivergent stuff. Like they have friends and they're wondering about who those friends are and how to be in the world. And it's a very murky, messy, mucky place because they're not ready for the YA stuff, but they're also done with the sort of typical middle grade books, and how to give them, some truths, right? Those truths that they're seeking, and in a way that is sensitive to their where they are developmentally, that's going to meet them where they're at. But, okay, I've been thinking about this topic, and here's a story that kind of guides me through one way of looking at it,
Yeah. I love that phrase of liminal space. It's like the liminal space of the liminal space, because I think the other categories are just growing more divided. Like YA, half of YA readers are adults, which is fun and awesome, but it's made YA almost more of fantasy making for adults, wishing they were teens, more than honestly really where I was a teen. If I was reading YA as a teen, I've been like, oh, this is like not for me. I would have wanted upper middle grade as a young high schooler, I think even. So yeah, I love this point of it being, you're dealing with these difficult topics. I think when I started writing, I thought middle grade was like fluffier, easier, like you couldn't deal with real issues. And so I really love that upper middle grade is a space where we're talking to our readers, not down to them. We're talking to them as human beings, but we are thinking about how a 13, 14-year-old, somebody in this middle space needs to talk about these things.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of getting into this, but why is this an important category? Why do we need this upper middle grade? Do you want to start, Maria?
Yeah, I'll start. I feel like, and I see it with more like my 12-year-old who's going on 13 too. I think it's easy to lose readers in this sort of murky upper middle grade space because they're not being met with books that are challenging them with the topics that they need to be exposed to. So it's important because we don't want to lose readers. You know, 4th graders, 5th graders, they're voracious readers, right? 3rd graders, 4th graders, they're just constantly reading. And then I kind of stopped reading in 6th and 7th and 8th grade. Like, I was kind of not finding books that were meeting me. That was a longer time ago, but I think for that reason, to maintain kids loving their love of reading. So that would be one reason it's important. There are many others if you'd like to take another one.
Well, I can just say, so I'm a longtime teacher and I also tutor kids, and when my tutoring students get to this age, what we're talking about, and some of them I work with for years, I notice them saying, I really want to read about the real stuff. I really want to read about the stuff that's hard. And the kids just ask for it. Because they're ready and they just want to know, and they want honesty.
Yeah, they want
about
those
the
nuggets
world
of truth. You know.
And there's just so much that kids can experience and learn. We talk about windows and we talk about mirrors. They can see themselves or they can see others, and I just think it's so helpful for developing empathy. And they're figuring out what kind of person they want to be in the world, and I think getting to walk in someone else's shoes and have an experience that they might not have had otherwise gives them that sense of empathy.
And what's replacing those books now, right? Like now, kids in the upper middle grade space are, you know, the 30-second TikTok sound bites and the 10-second TikTok sound bites, because they're not finding the books that are taking them on journeys and exposing them to these truths that they're seeking.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely the competition against TikTok. Which is not to say I'm not I do like a good dance. my 11-year-old teaches
Let's do
them
one
to me.
after
I'm
the
not that
panel.
cool, shall we? It'll go viral. I think, to add on to what the two of you have said, the reason this is such a critical category, the reason we need it, is because we also need to provide, I think, the value of it. And I don't want to be patronizing, but I want to say the value of this is ways to get into the conversations that they're having with people. When you are, kids read up, right? So the upper middle grade, even though we're talking about characters who are 13 years old, maybe even 14 years old, it's not just the 13 or 14-year-old that's reading us. They're 10 and 11. And these are the beginnings of conversations that are more complex than they've ever had before. And this, I think, provides another kind of window into how to have the conversations, how to feel, I hesitate to use the word safe because it can be loaded, but it can certainly give you ways to see how other people have talked and experienced and navigated these life spaces that can be about these really big topics.
Yeah, that's a good point about the word safe. I think I'm trying to find a better word, but there is something about the fact that this is fiction. So it's a space where you can dissect these things and slow down, where in everyday life you can't necessarily do that. So I think there's a safety in the fictionalized, that separation, so that you can start thinking about it.
That's good. Yeah.
And I was on a similar train of thought of y'all, so I don't want to repeat what you said, but I think this is an age where people are starting to ask really important questions, and they will look for those answers. And so I would want to be able to create a space with an answer that I hope points to what's true, because there's so much false information out there, especially for like my topic with mental health and autism. There's a lot of things that are like very not true. There's a lot of fake news, false information, and so I'd love to be able to provide a space as an author where somebody can learn true things about that, and ideally we can, as you say, retain these readers so that they can learn from valuable, meaningful books. So, but you guys really said it so well. I don't feel like
No,
I really
but I
have to.
think you synthesized everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a really good way of just bringing it all together.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, good synthesizing.
Thank you. So we've briefly touched on some of the things we talked about in our books, but I'd really love for us to have this opportunity to maybe say a little bit more about each of our books, and especially since we mentioned this idea of some I love that, Heather, of chewier topics, you know, that we have. Each of us just take an opportunity to share briefly, you know, some of the things that your book talks about. Maybe if you want to say like an elevator pitch of what your book is, so readers can know more. Heather, if you want to start.
Sure. I will admit I'm in the middle of editing my next book, and so you said that and I had a moment of panic, like, what's my book about? I don't know, because I'm so immersed in another book right now. What did I write? The Indigo and Ida is about an 8th grade journalist, so she's part of this gap. She's 8th grade, and we don't really publish a lot of books about 8th graders. She's an 8th grade journalist who is trying to figure out how to get her friends back. She got ghosted by her friends, and she's looking for ways to seem cool to them again so that they'll want to be with her. And so she's trying to do these stories that are edgy and will bring them back and want them to have her near them. And as she does these edgy stories, she discovers a story that is truly edgy about her own school and wants to publish this story, and gets a lot of pushback because she's told, oh, you're just imagining things, because the story has to do with suspicion of bias in discipline. So there's an election involved in this. She's trying to get elected as well to the student government. And all along the way, she is leaning on a sheaf of letters she has found written by 19th century journalist and activist Ida B. Wells. And as she's reading these letters, she is not only learning the story of Ida B. Wells, but she's being empowered by the true history of what Wells went through in her lifetime as an investigative journalist. And that was way longer than my 30-second elevator
That's okay.
DC escalator, but I'll stop there.
DC escalator like that.
The DC escalator.
Did you want me to go ahead?
Yes.
Okay. So my book, It Happened on Saturday, is the story of a 13-year-old, another 13-year-old character. Her name is Julia, and she is going through kind of a tough time with some friends have moved away, and her other best friend has met a boy at camp, so she's feeling kind of lonely, is a little vulnerable, and she ends up getting a makeover from her older sister as a fun bonding activity, and she meets someone online who turns out to be not who he says he is, and she has to escape from a very dangerous situation. And then after that, there's a whole period of recovery from trauma and just finding herself again and being able to find the courage to share with her friends what happened to her, because she doesn't want anything like that happening to them. But it really takes a lot to find that strength in herself.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And my book, so by the way, I read all 3 of your books and they're just so amazing, all of them. Turtles of the Midnight Moon is my 2 protagonists are also, they're turning 13 that summer. And it is set in Honduras, which is where I grew up, and it is about 2 girls. It's a dual point of view, so it's told in alternating POVs, Verana and Abby. And so they each have, their own inner conflicts to resolve, but what brings them together is an environmental issue, which has to do with sea turtles being poached on Verana's beach, sea turtle eggs being poached. And Verana has a very special, almost magical connection to the leatherback sea turtles that are nesting on her native beach. And Abby sort of learns to appreciate that, and they come together and they start sleuthing around and trying to figure out what's going on. And their big mission is to protect the sea turtles and to get to the bottom of that mystery. So it is an eco-mystery, but it does deal with issues of climate change, and there's a lot of that in the subtext, and pollution and what we're doing to our environment. And Abby is very much trying to figure out who she is, and there's some friendship troubles in her arc. And she's a photographer. She sees the world through her lens of photography, and it's also about her kind of putting the camera aside and, learning about herself.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was long too.
It's okay. We're giving a richer sense of what our books are about. I love that we have the time to be able to do that, because we don't always get to. It's often like, here's a quick thing. So Good Different, it's a novel in verse with a protagonist that turns 13 in the book, so you see a common factor here. She wishes she was powerful like the dragons she loves, but every day she has to put on a mask to survive in a neurotypical world. The world is constantly attacking her from a sensory perspective, and she's decided the way I need to cope is I just need to put up with it. Everyone else puts up with this stuff every day, so I do too. I need to put on my mask and get through it, until one day she can't do that anymore. It all builds up, she blows up, and she accidentally hits a classmate, and her world changes in that moment. Everybody who thought Selah was this good student now has turned on her and sees her as dangerous, a problem. Maybe she needs to leave the school and go somewhere else. So Selah needs to decide, how to respond to that, if she wants to change schools, or if she wants to fight for accommodations where she is. And part of her journey is discovering that poetry is a way she can communicate and advocate for her needs. Not always being great at being verbal, she finds that writing is a way that she can process her thoughts and really feel empowered. So this book obviously talks about being autistic, and talks about the ways that neurodivergent kids can be discriminated for their behavior in schools, and how their behavior is often misinterpreted. Often it is assumed that there's a moral problem there, like they're doing this thing because they're being bad, as opposed to there's a sensory need that is not being met. And so it's really challenging how we view things like autism and neurodivergence, and opening up that conversation for neurodivergent kids and for neurotypical kids of, how do we talk about this stuff? How do we help folks who need accommodations? So something that I had a second part of this question. I'm glad I didn't ask it at that time so we could really focus on that. But why middle grade for these topics? Did you try other age categories and land on this? What was the process? Do you want to start, Maria?
I taught middle school, and my children are both in that sort of murky middle age group. I remember how formative that time was for me as a person, and the books I would have liked to have had that represented who I was when I was 12, 13, 14, that I didn't have access to. So on the one hand, I'm writing them for, 13-year-old Maria, but also for my kids, and also I love that. I just love middle school kids. I think they're truth tellers. They call things out like they are. I'm also a teacher, and so you show up to school and you've got a different hairdo, they'll tell you right away.
And whether they like it.
Yeah, and it is it's a huge transitional period, and I think that it would be a missed opportunity to not have enriching books that really meet this age. So I love 12, 13, 14-year-olds. It's also fun to write, you can imbue a little magic in your books and it's still okay. You can have a detective sleuthing story and it's still okay. YA, I feel like I've thought about writing some YA. I'm not there yet. I'm really happy where I'm at in middle grade.
It's a good place.
Yeah, and the opening poem in Turtles was originally intended for a picture book, a poem picture book, but yeah, I think it's perfect where it is.
So my book, it really felt to me like for the events to happen the way they do, that 13 was the right age for the character. So it was always going to be an upper middle grade, and what I really tried to balance in my book was honesty with sensitivity, because the topic is a tough one that I couldn't find anything about. Social media safety, human trafficking, there were things in YA certainly, but nothing in middle grade. And I worked with child trafficking survivors for a while and realized that these 10 to 14-year-olds are a very, very vulnerable age group. And there needs to be a way to reach them before or during the time they're most vulnerable. So I wanted to have a book for that age. And when I was writing it, I really tried to balance friendship, family situations. There are horses in my book. My main character volunteers at a horse rescue barn, and she loves the horses. And there's a lot of there's cats also that are when everyone asks you, are any of the characters in your book based on real people? The cats in my book are based on cats. It's always kind of fun. They're little superstar characters in the book now. And there's just the school stuff and the family stuff, as I said. So there's a lot more to it than the trafficking, near escape from that, and the situations that come out of it. She's in a counseling group with kids who have been through other traumas, and part of this book to me was an opportunity, because I feel like the world is so traumatic right now. There's so much going on that kids go through, so many different experiences that are so hard. I've had a lot of mental health counseling training and trauma-informed counseling training in my volunteer work, and so I thought this was an opportunity to put some of that out there too, so that kids who've been through any kind of trauma or any kind of really stressful situation can go into this counseling group with my main character and learn strategies to help themselves, and to be able to talk to their families, to be able to talk to their friends about something really hard. So that's a big part of the story too. And again, I just felt like for that age group, it would be something that I hope can really help a lot of kids.
It's funny that you said that the cat in your book is actually the one real character, because I have a cat in my book that is also based on a real character. Fuzzy Lou Who was our cat. And before I talk about mine a little bit, I just wanted to say, echoing what Maria said, I've also read all of our books. We're part of the same debut group, and they're such good books. I am so honored to be in the company of such great authors, and I think it's a wonderful year for debut novels. The reason I chose YA, specifically upper YA, was for a lot of what Maria and Sydney have said about loving the age group, but also because as a middle grade reader, I was a voracious reader. And I loved the books that I read. I was the Narnia kid. I was the Wrinkle in Time. I read Anne of Green Gables. I read everything Laura Ingalls Wilder ever read, which I know has some opportunities now for more processing than we did during those days. But none of those characters looked like me. And there weren't a lot of characters on the shelves that looked like me. In fact, I don't think I ever found any. So one of the things that I really wanted to do was be a part of a bookshelf that included characters that had more of what we have out here in the world, and that would include me. So I did try writing YA. The first book I ever wrote was YA. I think all of us can sit here and tell you the first book we ever wrote was terrible. So my first book was terrible, and it was YA, and it wasn't the right space for me. I wanted to find a space where you could still make fart jokes, but you have to be a little, still be kind of cool about it. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I was just eyeing that one.
That's easy.
Thank you.
So there's an opportunity for sort of wacky humor, but also serious thinking, like we've also already talked about. And I love the sophistication of this age group, because my writing style isn't simple. I am, I think we can safely say all four of us are literary writers.
Yeah.
And I loved, and this is my daughter right here, when my daughter was reading things like Heidi Heckelbeck, or when my son was reading Magic School Bus. Those were really fun books, but that's not my writing style. I wanted something that was, in addition to being thematically chewier, actually linguistically chewier as well. So that landed me squarely in upper middle grade category, whether I wanted to be there or not. So.
Yeah, I had a similar journey to you. I started in YA, and I was so determined to be a YA writer. I'm not sure why, but you decide something, you get stubborn about it. But I kept getting editorial feedback that my voice was really in between YA and middle grade, and I resisted that for a very long time, and I have written some YA, but this book just popped out of me. And when it popped out of me, I said, this is not YA. This is middle grade. Like, it was just very evident to me. But it came very naturally. And I found that I really enjoy middle grade, I think, because of that in-between. I don't know, I suspect this is in part because of being neurodivergent autistic. I'm often told that my characters sound young, the voice sounds young, but in middle grade that's acceptable. So we've got some work to do in YA maybe for that, but I guess the things that feel big to me, the things that I'm processing, they seem to make the most sense in middle grade, and I'm okay with that. I think it's a really great category, and I think it's one I underestimated when entering it. But it's got so much space. We can talk about anything, really. It's just how we talk about it and what parts we zoom into. So I'm quite happy in this space as well.
Same.
And I apologize for this next question because, Sydney, I'm not sure it's going to apply as much to you, but if it does, please jump in. I just wanted to acknowledge that because something that you brought up, Maria, and something that was interesting to me because I think we were talking about our next books, and magic is something that is kind of a device used by all of us to some degree. And I'm really curious about why magic. If you wanted to say anything about the integration of magic in difficult topics, Heather, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah. So the device that I use in my book is actually magical realism, which is different from magic, and I love magical realism as a literary technique for talking about people who have had an oppressed people or people who have been marginalized. It is often confused with magic because there is magic involved, but it's more than that. So there is an element of magical stuff in Indigo and Ida, but it's a story about a community, about a people who have faced discrimination, who have faced racism, and the use of magical realism is a technique that allows for playing with overcoming and coping and dealing in general, and it is unique to populations of people who have faced oppression. So it is a not well understood literary technique. You hear the phrase magical realism being thrown around a lot, but the magical realism that is truly using that literary technique is coming from Gabriel Garcia, it's coming from The People Could Fly, it's coming from Isabel Allende. My brain just checked out on me, and I can't think of the author of Like Water for Chocolate, where she cries and the river and the beginning when she's born. That's all magical realism. There's not a lot of genuine magical realism in the space of middle grade, and I wanted to find a way to carve some space out for myself in that. So that was where I came from on that.
Yeah, I'm similar to you. So I have, for me, the magical elements, and I struggle with whether I want to call it magical realism, but it's sort of an extended metaphor in my novel, where the wooden sea turtle totems that the girls each find separately, they kind of keep sort of secret and tucked away in their pockets. They, change temperature, they get hot, they get cold, they get warm, they glow, and it's sort of this thread of a metaphor that is representative of their friendship and their growth together and coming together and, their friendship, really. So that's one element. The other element that's sort of magical, you can think of it as magical. And with the totems, we never know who made them. How did they show up? Where did they come from? Who carved them? So there's that mysterious element as well. And then the other element is Barana's connection to Luna, one of the leatherback sea turtles that comes ashore. And for me, that magical element with her scar that's shaped like a moon, and Luna has a very similar scar on her leatherback carapace. And there's this sort of magical connection between the two of them. And for me, that's more, I wanted to talk to the empath, to the kids who are empaths with animals. And I want to cry right now because I have such empathy for creatures. And like my dogs, like Luna kind of represented like my dog Oscar, like just that connection with an animal. And I think it's a misunderstood magic, like whatever you want to call it, and so I included it sort of for that reason. Yeah.
And I will say that I cried 3 times when I read Maria's book, and it was always when it had to do with those totems and with the turtles and Luna, and oh my goodness, yeah.
Yeah, so those were the 2. Yeah.
I love that.
And thank you, Heather, for that distinction of magic and magical realism. I apologize for the, how I worded that question. So that's really interesting, the idea of empathy and the idea of, marginalized communities. For me, my book that I've been working on has a magical element, and for me it was about generational trauma and neurodivergent generational trauma, and it was a painful topic for me. It was a difficult one, and it stemmed from something that happened that was upsetting to me. And so as I was working with the materials, trying to write it in the contemporary space and in the literal space, and I found that it was too difficult for me. It was too heavy, and I felt like I needed something to make this magical, to give it possibilities. So I guess I'm using the word magical really loosely. I need a different word. If anyone has a different word,
I think we get it. I think it's an umbrella.
It's something beyond the literal. It's something that gives us almost like empowerment and possibility, I think, when you feel like there is a lack of empowerment. And so just that touch of something beyond the literal and real gave me enough to access that material and go, okay, I can go into this, and I feel some sort of autonomy almost as a creator. Like, okay, I can recreate what happens here, or I can talk about it. I can give hope in this space where something feels hard and difficult to me. Did you guys feel similar ways of using it as a tool, or?
I don't know.
So you talked about it as like the joy, the positive.
Yeah, trying to give that, almost like it's actually a superpower, like having that empathy. And then with the friendship, I mean, you remember middle school friendships, especially 7th grade, 8th grade. It's tough, and friends come and go, and that's when you learn, who your friends are. And I think having the object sort of remind the girls, like, work through this, because you've got each other's back. And so, and then when they're like, being just stubborn and like angry, then, the totems go cold. And so I guess maybe, because friendship is hard. And so perhaps I was using the totems subconsciously as like a way to just remember that it's there and, work through it.
I think for me, the magic was a way to create a connection between Indigo and Ida and the lives that they were leading, which were parallel in many ways. And here you've got this 21st century girl and this 19th century woman, and the parallels are shocking in many ways, that they could still exist. And again, going with the use of magical realism as a literary technique for coping and explaining, part of my reaction to finding so many parallels in a world where we want to say, oh, that can't still be happening, right, was to use this magical realism to create those connections, to bridge that space.
Well said. Sydney, since you have it really grounded in real life, and you're also, of course, dealing with one of these chewy topics, were there any devices you used or any approaches you used to handle this material?
What I tried to do, as I mentioned before, I wanted to make the book feel relatable to kids. So the subject matter is something that I would assume most of the readers have not experienced, but they're going to be on social media, they're going to be communicating online, they're going to have strangers approach them because that's just what happens. And so I wanted to try to have readers understand how easily something like that could happen, and have the character of Julia be somebody that could be their friend or could be them. And something I've had readers share with me is, gosh, this could be my niece, this could be my daughter, this could be the kid down the street, just what Julia's like. And that was important to me, to make it feel like, oh, this isn't somebody that I have nothing in common with. Because we do of course know that trafficking victims are going to be disproportionately kids in really tough situations, kids who might be in foster care, or kids who might have run away from home, or kids who might be experiencing a lot of really tough things in their home. However, it also does happen to kids who don't have any of that going on. And so I think I tried to just make Julia very, very relatable so that kids could say, oh, I'm not going to say, oh, this would never happen to me. I'm never going to run away from home or something like that. And I also just wanted familiar friendship situations, because we all remember the times when the friend got the boyfriend and it's like, oh, who am I going to hang out with now? She's going to be so busy with him. Whether you were the friend with the boyfriend having to navigate it that way, or the friend, without, and the friends who've moved away. And the older sister who's got her license now, so she's like never home and isn't around. So very familiar things. And also when Tyler is the name of the person who reaches out, when he first reaches out to her, she doesn't respond. She knows better. She knows I shouldn't talk to a stranger. But then things get so much harder and she starts to feel so much lonelier when he keeps reaching out and he seems so nice and so interested in her that it's like, well, what's it gonna hurt just to talk to him a little bit? So just to show that a person doing sort of everyday things, not trying to take some big risk, not trying to do something they shouldn't do, how easily things like that can happen.
Absolutely. Were there any other things that you wanted to share about how you approach this material for middle grade? Any strategies you used? Or
I think humor is a big one, because it's a serious topic, right? Like, and there's climate anxiety, and my kids, with especially with animals, like, and trees even, like, just there's a lot of anxiety around what we're doing to the planet. And so trying to sort of show kids having that agency to do something about it, even if it's something small in your community. So showing that, and then having some humor alongside it, like, funny bits in the dialogue, and kids are kids and they're gonna be funny. So you're dealing with like an overarching theme that's sad, scary, all this other stuff, but chewy. But you show kids doing something, empowering them, and
Well, I was going to say, when we're approaching these tougher topics, I do think it's so important just to have, just fun, humorous things, and also just interesting settings, like part of my book takes place in a haunted mansion, like not literally haunted, because I know we're talking about magic, but actually just one of those Halloween ones, and at a festival, and there's just some variety, so it doesn't feel so heavy, and levity, like we've discussed with the animals, with just some everyday situations, with the cat's gonna jump up and knock this thing off right at the wrong time, and just some things that happen that can make it just feel like the hard part is part of a much bigger story. So I think that's what,
like, grounding moments.
Yes, exactly. For sure.
I do use humor, like Maria was saying. I do like to use humor in all of my books. And also I like those moments, observational moments, that connect what I'm talking about to the age of the kids. I have a scene that I was just working on where my two friends are walking down the street, and in an adult book, we'd be walking down the street and be, really deeply engaged, and maybe one of them would put a hand on her heart or throw her hands up in the air. One of my characters is hopping over the cracks in the sidewalk, because of course when you're 11, although I have to admit I still don't step on a crack, because you don't want to break your mama's back, right? So those are the kinds of things that we think about that are observational, that show us exactly where we are, and it also does a little bit of grounding, because it gives us a moment to get out of that stuff.
I think for me, using the verse form, these poems, you have a lot of white space, and each one's really short, so it gives you that breathing room, so you don't have to linger too long in anything that's too heavy. You can kind of take a pause, and then kind of go back in. And the other thing that's helpful to me to think about is, I've been told that middle grade tends to end more hopefully. We try to end on, like, how can we find hope in this situation, while YA can allow for hope, but it also can allow for a little bit more, skepticism, and kind of the harshness of the world. And so with working on middle grade and difficult topics, when I'm writing it, I'm always trying to think, like, what's the hope I can find in this difficult thing? And so I find relief that we have an ending where we can do that, instead of just ending in the awful. So, man, there's a lot of things I want to ask, but I think we're going to end between 6:15, at least our formal conversation. So I'm trying to think of what I want to say next. I guess we touched on the fact that our characters are all on like the older end of middle grade, right? So I'd be curious, did anybody receive backlash or reluctance from gatekeepers or the community about having an older character? Because I think, Heather, you said it almost like encouraged to us.
Yeah,
so
that was funny because you read about how you're never supposed to have these older characters, and so I deliberately made Indigo a younger character. And it was my agent who said, I think she's really an 8th grader, Heather. So we boosted her, and she's my agent. So, she stands to lose if she can't get me sold. So I went with it, and my editor agreed that she should be an 8th grader. So I think I am the exception to the rule because there's still a lot of aging down for the purposes of selling because of this gap, which...
And I'll say a little bit different. I had heard, having been very involved in writing organizations and hearing lots of talks about the different categories, and I had heard over and over, you need to have your character 8 to 12 for middle grade. You need to have them, like 15 ideally and up for YA. And so that really bothered me because I was just like, well, what about the 13-year-olds? And just people would just say, oh no, that's too hard to shelve in the bookstores. They aren't quite sure where to put it in the libraries. So no, just don't do that. So I'm a little bit more contrary, where if you tell me not to do it, I'm going to say, well, then I'm going to do it, because I don't like that. I don't like that you're saying 13-year-olds can't be the protagonist. And so I was like, well, then my protagonist needed to be 13 regardless. But the other part of it was like, okay, well, then my protagonist is definitely going to be 13 if you tell me that she can't. Do you know what I
feel
mean?
that.
I really felt strongly, and fortunately my agent I don't even know if we talked about it, because she just read it and she was 13, and I think she really also felt that she needed to be, and the editor it was never like discussed really. It was just Julia's 13, so it was but yeah, it's like don't say not to do it. If it's something that needs to be done, then I'm gonna double down on it.
Watch.
Just watch me. Yeah, just watch me. So that's how I felt about it.
No, I didn't get any backlash, but again, mine turned 13 at the end of the summer. So they were actually 12 going on 13. But what's interesting is I have gotten rejections on books where the protagonist is 13 or 14, and we're dealing with specifically grief, which I know is a tricky subject. So Turtles didn't get any backlash, but I have experienced that sort of, this is, too heavy right now, that kind of feedback, but not so much for this.
I have received rejections, and part of it was with older characters, so not about grief. So I don't know, but I think that's part of that whole.
It's like a double whammy.
Yeah,
older character and
what do we do with this
topic.
age group? Publishing doesn't know what to do with the age group. And we have a category that's called upper middle grade. It's a real category, but you don't often see in libraries the section for it.
No.
It's either YA or MG, and so the middle grade readers are left to figure it out. And at school libraries, it's the same thing, right? School libraries are rarely, these days I think they're organized by genre more than organized.
I have a ton of 7th and 8th graders that have read my book and love it, and I feel like it meets 6th, 7th, and 8th graders so perfectly, but it's marketed for 8 to 12. And
And an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old are
vastly
in
different.
such different places.
And I wrote this thinking of like a 13-year-old, and the older 12-year-old, 13, even 14-year-olds can read the story and feel very empowered.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's interesting that it's just missing, like the MG shelves are not playing that way.
Every once in a while, I will say, I have heard of places that will have a tween section. There are some bookstores. I have a friend that works in one that they actually have a tween section, which is pretty cool, because tween is a thing. And that's why I think it's just so important. But it's nice that we can say, well, there are some getting published,
Yeah.
you know, for this age. But it is an interesting situation.
Yeah, and it's a real conversation that is being had out there in the world. I'm not sure why it's not being more resonant in the circles of those who publish the books, because it's still the marketing piece of it. If we're marketing for this age group, but writing for this age group, then there's this disconnect that's not making much sense. So
Yeah, why do you think publishing is so scared of this?
I'm going to ask you to hold on for just 1 second. Jennifer, I know you said you had to go because your son was in the pool. Do you have any questions before you have to jump?
Thank you for asking.
Yes.
I don't. I have really enjoyed this. I'm so glad I had the opportunity to meet you all, and I can't wait to read the book. So
Well, thank you
so
so
much. I
much.
really
Thanks for
appreciate your
coming.
time. Oh my goodness, thank you.
Thank you.
And my
It's
son
really
will be
nice
13
meeting
in
you.
December. So.
Oh.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Nice
Yeah,
to meet
have a
you.
great
Yeah.
evening.
Nice to
Bye.
meet you.
Thank you.